Steve, it's been a long time since we've had a chance to talk, and I think this is the first time I've got you on the SBG podcast, but is it the first time?
But it's been a while. Yeah, you and I sat down together in the gym when I was there, but
that's right.
It's been a while, yeah.
It's the second time. So for those that don't know, you're one of, what I would consider the original kind of founding members of the gym. When SBG first started to leave Oregon back in the late 90s, really around 22 years ago or so, you were one of the first coaches. But for people who don't know you well, you want to give a brief bio there of your experience and your training?
Sure. Like all of us at the time, we all kind of came from traditional martial arts background, moved into the JKD arena, and then had some experiences and critiques of it based on those experiences. And then kind of all came together. And as I've often said, well before I had a chance to train with you in person, and you became a close friend, I liken you to the Pied Piper of aliveness, sort of, because we, as the coaches, the original coaches, all kind of compared notes. We all had very similar types of experiences, although we're all very different people. And it was really you kind of being vocal in the public forum and, kind of boisterously articulating those same things that we were experiencing and the conclusions that we had come to. It sort of galvanized everybody together. And then, everybody found SBG. So I'm always thankful for that. And anyway, so I had started to these like everybody, these stepping stones of evolution. And first thing I did was I didn't have any Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu available to me, although I was interested in it from a long time ago. Like most people, when the UFC first started and experienced kind of a schema violation and, really had to question a lot of things. But I did get into the JKD, which did have some functional aspects to it, although a lot of it was kind of the dead pattern training. And then I got into Muay Thai. So I had a pretty solid foundation in striking. Eventually, I did branch out because we did have my professor, Roberto Maia, who was the godfather of BJJ here in Massachusetts. So we only had, or I should say New England. So the whole region here at that time only had one actual black belt. And he'd grown up with all the Gracies. They were all his cousins and the Machados and everything. And really technical, really knowledgeable. It was a very good school. And so I joined, and that started that. And that was the late 90s. That's when I first met John Frankel, who's always been kind of like a jiu-jitsu big brother to me. And then we both came aboard, the organization. At the same time, got all my black belts all the way through from Roberto. And then I did, around the same time I came on board with SBG, I also by geographical good fortune, had a chance to start working with Mark Delagrati, who's just a brilliant striking coach, also comes from the same background we do, and actually really sought out conceptually the closest thing to kind of like a JKD functional approach, like very strategic approach to all the camps he traveled around and trained in Thailand, which was Sit Yat Tong, which still to this day has produced more, of the top level champions than anybody else in history, along with multiple, as in a bunch, I've lost count, professional boxing champions out of a Thai camp, which is really unique. So we all speak the same language pretty much. And kind of the rest is history. Just kept getting more and more experience in all those arts.
Yeah. You mentioned Roberto Maia and him being the first guy in the area, and everybody back then, Kenny Florian, everybody basically in that area that was trained and came through Roberto's school, right? Am I correct?
Yeah. There was really a dynasty in that early day. I mean, I say that like I was his 10th black belt, I believe. Mm-hmm. I mean, now between Roberto's lineage and all the other organizations that have come in, it went from like one guy to now just Massachusetts alone, where I'm at, has hundreds of black belts. I mean, there's a lot, you know, it's really grown. But at the time, that was it. There was Roberto and our academy, which had, you know, a fairly small number of people training there, but the quality was good. The rapport was good. You know, the type of vibe that we all have together. I kind of felt that vibe in that environment. And that for a while, you know, that was really my favorite place to be. You know, you know, when I was going to start there and kind of like bring up my ground game one day a week. And then ultimately what happened was, you know, you get the bug and then it's 2 days a week, it's 3. Next thing I know, it was 6, you know, and it was a little more Wild West back then. And probably some of my injuries now are directly attributable to kind of just the going hard, sparring and resisting submissions.
We needed to.
Yeah. Yeah. But, you know, but it was quality, and it definitely set me on the path. So if I had met Roberto or I hadn't, you know, made the choice to go down that route, I probably would have been, you know, well behind the game. So,
yeah. Well, you're in a unique position to talk about certain subjects that I want to discuss with you today. But some of the people that follow SBG know that my first exposure to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, really my blue belt, came from Rickson.
right.
And then I was able to reconnect with him a few years ago. And also all of us have been training with Henry Akins, Rickson's black belt, who's now become a member of SBG, which we're proud to have. But you, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you had actually managed to train with Henry first out of all of us. You connected with him first and then kind of, you know, told Frankel and myself and everybody else about how good that was. And is that correct? Do I have that right?
Yes. So, right. That's how it kind of went down. It was 2014. Because so the little quick backstory there was that when Kenny and Keith Florian were going down, you know, for the first half of Kenny's UFC career, right up until he got, you know, super busy, kind of blew up, and I was, you know, starting my academy down here. And so I was just, you know, 24/7, 365, just, you know, working on the business. But I was still, even when I started it, going back and forth to train with him every week. I was one of his main training partners right up until he fought Sean Shirk. But during the early years of his MMA career and everything, or late jiu-jitsu, when he was just doing jiu-jitsu to MMA career, he and Keith were going down to the original, like, Gracie Baja, you know, where it was kind of like there was Alliance and there was like the Gracie Baja in Brazil. And those were like the pressure cooker, you know, professional jiu-jitsu environments producing all the champions at the time. And so our lineage with Roberto and everything was through them. So they were going down there and training and then competing down there. And there was a couple of occasions. One was a little bit earlier, and then the other one was when I was actively training with Kenny for his UFC fights. They went down there, and Henry happened to be there at the same time, and they connected. And so Kenny would train with Henry and stuff, and then he'd just bring back some of these details and the invisible jiu-jitsu. And he'd share them with me because I was, you know, working with him like very, you know, close, very intimately. And, you know, it was just so clear, like, why Rickson was the man when you can actually see it. Because a lot of people get so distracted by sort of the legend and the 400-0 record and everything that they just kind of roll their eyes and they just look at him as being the really good guy back then. Mm-hmm. But past the time and no longer relevant and all that stuff. And, you know, it's just kind of missing like what he actually contributed. But once you feel it, you get it, right? So I had a bit of exposure to that. There's a few things that are in the SBG curriculum we were teaching back then that I remember I kind of, either John or I, through Kenny, through Henry, kind of showed everybody. And, but, you know, we only had the bits and pieces we got, and then what we were able to then extrapolate into other areas. Now, 2014, I trained with Henry because he went to Pennsylvania. So I made the drive there. I never drive for seminars, but I went for his because he's finally on the East Coast. Right. And I spent 2 days there. We instantly hit it off. And I just said, this is it. This is the highest expression of efficient jiu-jitsu, kind of what we're all aspiring to. Henry had the advantage of not only having a very good mind for it, to his credit, but also, the guy who trained the longest and the closest to Rickson of anybody. And so, very fortunate to make that connection. So I immediately, of course, wanted to share it with all you guys. And so then next thing you know, everybody's starting to make a connection. I think John next went to LA and trained with him in person. And then you guys started bringing him in and everything. The rest is history. But yeah, it's very.
Mention that because when I look back on the SBG curriculum that we had for 30 years, the stuff that we would emphasize the most, the stuff that I would emphasize the most, that I would wind up teaching the most of it in one way or another had come piecemeal through someone else from Rickson. So for example, the tuck in the tailbone inside the closed guard, that came from Chris Howder, but Chris got it from Rickson. That was from him training with Rickson. So I look back at all the pieces that I found to be really essential in terms of posture, in one way or another, seem to have come to us through someone else, but ultimately was Rickson's lineage, Right. It's kind of funny. Right. So you're in a great position to explain this because you spent such a long time with training with Roberto, and you've been through all the curriculum and the whole evolution with us. So when you're talking to someone else, let's say you're talking to a jiu-jitsu instructor who's not me, who has the kind of preconceived notion that you mentioned, that you articulated well a minute ago, where they think he was just a guy back then, but jiu-jitsu is jiu-jitsu, and if anything, it's evolved. How are you going to explain to that person what's different about Rickson's technique?
Right. So I think the important heuristic that we can have here, like a mental model, is the difference between first principles and reasoning by analogy. So interesting, like for anybody that wants to just do a quick YouTube search, type in like Elon Musk first principles, and you'll see a couple videos pop up that are very short. And, he's pretty much the kind of the perfect example of a public, figure. He's always toggling between first and second, with Bezos as the richest guy in the world. But, he's an engineer first and foremost, and kind of an entrepreneur second. And, everything he's done has been, he's always come in as an outsider. He's always been disruptive. He's obviously brilliant. He's a genius, but he's a first principles thinker. And he's the first person, even as highly intelligent as he is, to talk about how difficult that is to do. But my argument is always, it's very hard to do everywhere, even if you're intelligent. But if you are really invested in some particular area, a few areas in our life where we devote most of our time and attention, it's fucking worth it. So reasoning by analogy, sort of the blanket logical fallacy way of saying like what the crowd's doing, kind of passing on conventional wisdom, status quo sensibilities, modeling on the norm. And first principles really is what I think kind of retrospectively SBG's always been very good at being in the process of, is stripping away the assumptions and kind of going down to the very basement, foundational level. And once you've gotten down to the most essential components of whatever the question is or the problem is, you build up from there, right? And so like now you hear people who are, in the spotlight, there's a bit of reasoning from authority that goes on here, but you hear somebody who's a brilliant trainer like John Danaher and everything, saying not even something reasoning by analogy close to what we were saying about methodology, right? But essentially saying the exact same shit we were saying, but only now do people go, whoa, and, so it's just, that's the nature of the beast. You have to understand it. But the thing about Rickson is, so the thing to kind of pull out of this historical figure and all of this shit is, Rickson was probably the greatest first principles thinker that we've ever had in jiu-jitsu. And I would argue nobody thinks about him as an innovator. I would argue he's probably our greatest example of an innovator in jiu-jitsu for this reason. It was on your podcast with him when he was in Portland for that seminar. I think I talked about this the last time I was with you, but it was on that podcast that he said what I think is like the most badass thing I've ever heard, which I'm not going to get this exactly right, but to paraphrase, he's like, there's a lot of people out there like world-class, top of the food chain athletes and stuff that have amazing technique. But what I realized is that it's based on still like a partial connection. But he's like, you know, I was never the slowest guy or the weakest guy. I always had a pretty good body and I could make it work, you know, athletically. But what about jiu-jitsu for the people that will never have that and aren't that level an athlete? What I really wanted to do was find the kind of follow my dad, Elio, and like get the best expression of jiu-jitsu. So what I did was I went through all the positions, all the techniques, and I discovered the full connection. Right? And I think it's so easy for people to just fucking breeze over that statement, like, yeah, whatever. And it's like, no, you realize what a monumental thing that is. Mm-hmm. And then you realize why, because we've had all these stories like validated, if you want to put it in context, right? Yeah, now he's, whatever, is he 60 or something like that? I don't know. But at the time that he was like 40 and already had, you know, really bad back and a couple other injuries, right? And he had the people that were the best at the time coming into his academy when he was only insulated, training with his own students. Very few of them were even black belts, right? And these world-class guys would come in that were basically training as professional athletes for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And he would just adapt to their movements and shut down games that he had never encountered before.
Yeah.
You know, and I think one of the best expressions of what we're talking about is the story about one particular very well-known world champion who was credited as kind of being the best guy with the spider guard, like an innovator of the spider guard. And as the story goes, Henry was there in person, corroborated this, that he was giving Rickson a hell of a time. Rickson couldn't pass his guard because every time, all of a sudden, a little rotation, the foot pummels back in and he's caught up in the web again. So it wasn't that he was actually threatened about being submitted, but he just couldn't pass, and you could see everybody's like, he visibly frustrated. So he went home and grabbed Rickson, who I believe was 12 at the time. And as Henry always says, this is so critical. Like, he solved the problem, never technique for technique. It was never like, I need to have a new game to answer this problem. It was always movement for movement on the most first principles fundamental level.
Yeah.
And then his theory was, right, if I could get my 12-year-old son to be able to then do it on me after I've worked it out on him, and I'm an adult and I'm a big, strong Rickson or whatever, like, then I can do it to anybody. So then he went in the next day and he would just walk through this guy's guard, and the spider guard was never a problem. And I'll just say one more thing about this, because I think it's relevant. It's kind of been something that's been a really part of my thinking recently, is that kind of tied into the first principles approach, which will, you know, transcend whatever historical period that Rickson was taking place in, right? It was what he was able to do, is this concept of anti-fragile. So this, I think, was a huge contribution for, like, we could think about this in the context of the SBG tree, right? And anti-fragile or anti-fragility is a concept that comes from Nassim Taleb. And basically what it means, he's talking more generally about, you know, markets, and then how to basically have an anti-fragile infrastructure when at any time you could have like a black swan event, like a pandemic or a market crash or something come. And so his observation in a very simplified, kind of reductive form, is that there's a difference between a robust system or a robust company or whatever, right? A robust approach and a truly anti-fragile approach. Because the key quality of anti-fragility is that when you have outside stressors, right, some sort of stimulus that will be potentially devastating to even a robust system, an anti-fragile system actually assimilates that and becomes stronger. And I always kind of use the analogy of the Ang Lee Hulk in that movie, because whenever you shot him, he would get angrier and then he'd actually get bigger, more jacked. And so it's kind of like anti-fragile. And so tying that into what we're talking about, I think Rickson's genius is, Henry said, if you could, he wasn't always the best explaining it, but if he could come in and feel it, he was the best instructor in the world, because he had such an amazing sensibility about movement for movement, the human body, and figuring out those connections. He could problem solve anything very quickly and then have a solution to shut it down. It was like his genius. So connection is really the anti-fragile thing, right? That's the thing that takes what I think we always had in SBG with our methodology and the prioritization of posture and pressure and everything. And then you add the connection to it. Like now you're talking about a truly anti-fragile system, because it's not to say like any of us that are, 40, 50-year-old instructors or something, oh, I understand, connection on a pretty decent level. So I'm going to take, the best guy in the world and I'm going to solve all the problems he presents. That's not what we're talking about. But on a level that anybody could achieve, right, that would be the guy. That would be the highest expression of efficiency. So,
right. That's super interesting. So if we look at one of the newer coaches, not newer, he's a 20-year work in progress, but somebody who's gotten a lot of attention recently for the right reasons, because athletes like Gordon Ryan are obviously amazing. Danaher, I have my own opinion about his approach versus Rickson's approach, but I'm curious to hear your distinction between the two approaches.
Right. Yeah, it's. I was actually just talking to John about this.
That's where.
By the way, we had the fortune to meet John Danaher, who I've been in Danaher's circles for many years, right? Because of my Henzo is Roberto's cousin, right?
Yeah.
But and I've seen Henzo a bunch of times, but I never actually crossed paths with John Danaher. So John Danaher and Gordon Ryan were both filming in the studio.
Yeah.
I was there with John last weekend, so that was cool. I'm a huge Gordon Ryan fan, but I think the main thing that I would say about that is that I believe that if you look at, say, the leg lock game, the first thing that the Danaher Death Squad became known for, and very interesting and smart if you look at like how they made how John Danaher kind of architected an insertion point into the competitive landscape. Once they decided that's what their goal was, they said, look, we don't have a bunch of black belts that have been training like, their whole life. That's not the ones who are on this team. So what's our asymmetric advantage? It's to be able to orient all of our training around the weak spot in the current paradigm, right? Which is the lower body. So he was able to innovate what I really consider to be having trained with one of the members who is an excellent instructor, teaches just like we do, from the Danaher Death Squad. Like, he's not one of the name guys, but he's excellent. And I've seen a good amount of it, even though I'm by no way, shape, or form a master. And it's like, that is a first principles approach to controlling and isolating and finishing the legs, and then being able to ultimately kind of systematically tie that into the rest of the jiu-jitsu landscape, right? So I think that's brilliant. I think that he has some obviously proven and very similar, if not the same, concepts about kind of the training and drilling methodologies that we do. It's just obviously like he's doing that with a professional team, whereas most of us are dealing primarily with, more recreational athletes that might compete at a lower level. But then fundamentally, I think that I just wish that we could have a marriage of the two approaches, because on some of the fundamentals I've seen, whether it comes to, for instance, how to use the weight distribution in guard passing situations, or has to do with some of the escaping concepts. What I've seen from there, a lot of the stuff kind of reminds me of like what I was exposed to earlier, but not so much the things that I've learned since I've been, more immersed in the Rickson world, right? And I know that like you and John Frankel, Glenn, and I are kind of like all really spending a lot of time and mental energy and training energy on that stuff. Yeah. So, I just kind of see it everywhere. And so I just think like it would be amazing to have all the innovations and the coaching technology that he's brought to the table kind of combined, because I think that there's a little bit of a abyss between the two, and they're not totally speaking to one another,
Yeah, definitely in the translation. One thing Frankel said that I think is really interesting and struck as true is the best part of maybe the part that I find the most admirable about what he did with leg locks is he put them in a delivery system where you can train it gently. And I've seen that with, for example, Ryan, where he'll put the heel hook on. He has control of the other guy's body. And he's like, are you going to tap? He's not slamming it on and winning with the heel hook because he's going super hard and fast. They've right. turned it into positional control, which is really jiu-jitsu, right? They've taken the leg lock game and they've jiu-jitsu-fied it, for lack of a better term. So it's position first, which I think is very cool. I hadn't seen that to the degree before. The leg locks I saw generations previous to that, whether it was the Brazilians or the Japanese or Americans that were doing them, there was always a sense of speed associated with it, which also came with a sense of danger. Mm-hmm. And the way he's doing it, it seems like you could actually train that in a healthy way with a room full of people and nobody has to get their knees torn out.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But I understand what you mean about the weight distribution. You can see that aspect of it as well. I also think that there's something to be said in terms of how they prioritize, where it seems to me that Danaher always starts at the beginning and works his way there. Mm-hmm. As the approach with Rickson and Henry, they always seem to go what is most important first, right? Mm-hmm. And there's that level of efficiency that's very hard to match.
Right, exactly. Always kind of working backwards from the end in mind.
Yes.
It all depends on what your frame of reference is like, because, I'm sure they kind of argue, well, yeah, we do that. But, so a perfect example along those lines that I was just talking to John about is because, of course, we got back from his seminars he's doing here, and then we're down in my basement, like going over shit on the carpet, Yeah. And, one of the things we both kind of like, yes, to each other is to say like, when you see, for instance, and again, detail we got from Henry, made all the differences. Somebody's on your back, they're actively working to choke you, they're encircling your neck, whatever. It is true that the kinetic chain has to start with your feet on the floor if you're the defender.
Yes. But
your head isn't the last thing that you defend. Like, you don't hand fight and then use your head, right? Once you've efficiently hand fought, the first thing you do is you use your head. Yeah. You're transferring your weight from the floor, right? So it's like the point about the kinetic chain, right, is correct. Yes. But I feel like the priority, like you just said, is a bit reverse. Yeah. Because kind of like, what's the first thing you need to worry about? It's like not getting choked, right? So that's going to start with your head. I just don't know that people know how to use their head in that way.
Yeah,
it comes as a secondary thing rather than a primary thing. That's again, Rickson figured these things out, So
yeah, that's exactly one of the examples I was thinking of where it's more obvious, but you can see it in a lot of the other places.
Yes.
So one of the other things, all of us in SBG have made a point for the last 30 years of talking about how important it is to train stand-up, clinch, and ground. Mm-hmm. Most all the original instructors, the old school guys, have some stand-up, clinch, and ground, but most of us have also specialized more on one than the other. Myself, certainly for the last 20 years, I've focused primarily on Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu just because that's what I love, and I have not done much stand-up in the last couple decades.
Right.
You, on the other hand, have probably one of the few guys who spent maybe, the same amount of time perfecting your stand-up as you have your jiu-jitsu with, as you mentioned, your experience with the Sityotong striking. And there's as I'm sure you know right now, there's a huge value to that because, as Kavanaugh likes to say, we want to update the hardware or update the software without damaging the hardware. and finding an MMA coach who can truly coach other athletes in a live manner that translates directly to sparring without incurring that brain damage,
Right.
is such a valuable thing. And I know so many coaches that struggle with that. I mean, it's one thing to flow roll. That in and of itself is probably the hardest thing to do in jiu-jitsu.
Mm-hmm.
But to be able to take that ethos and do it striking seems to me to be 10 times harder, just because tempers can flare as soon as somebody throws a jab too hard and start to spiral out of control. So talk to me about how you can translate. And because I've seen your stand-up and I've seen where you teach, you do it in the same method that we do jiu-jitsu, and it's a way that's healthy and people aren't going to get banged up. So for somebody who hasn't been exposed to it, talk about how you're going to do that.
Right. I mean, really, this is the beautiful thing is like when you, again, it goes to first principles. When you step outside of the status quo bubble, in this case, like, you know, whatever the current paradigm of like, this is how we teach jiu-jitsu because that's the way I was taught. This is how we do whatever because that's the way I was taught. You just look like the wisdom's already out there if you are willing to sort of step outside and then come back. So the Thais already had the perfect template for training striking, whether we're talking about actual Muay Thai, the art, or even MMA. They already had it. And their reasoning was different. In Thailand, these athletes would often start as little kids, as you know, right? So they had to preserve themselves for their fights because they had so many fights and they have a very limited lifespan to be able to fight.
That's not to feed their family, right?
Yeah, exactly. And in many cases, you know, they're retired at a fairly young age, as far as we're concerned. That translates really well for people who don't want to have concussive brain damage, right, cumulative over time, who have to go to work the next day and not be all banged up, who go to school, whatever. That translates really well for that as well. So, you know, it's a very progressive and adaptive way of introducing flow and sparring and control, so that then the coach really just needs to be on facilitating that environment and checking whenever things start to escalate, right? And then it becomes self-sustaining at that point. In much the same way that I've seen, like I remember seeing, probably like 15 years ago, like whenever it was the very early days of like Flow Wrestling had a channel, and they were having like a John Smith wrestling practice. Now, granted, that's a high-level room. That's not a recreational room. But just seeing how it ran the practice, you know, it was like a perfect template for an MMA practice. This is like watching how he would, you know, they would basically have a kind of like a flow warm-up. And at any given point that he saw somebody do something really good, really clean, he would just stop. Either he would show what they did or he'd have them show what they did to the rest of the room. It would immediately turn into an introduction phase and an isolation phase, right? So if this is a beginner to intermediate room, we flip it. We do introduction, then isolation, and then they spar at the end. But in a higher level room, it's more of a practice for competition. They reverse the order, but it's just perfect. It's already there, you know? So as far as striking.
Not to interrupt you, but first, on that point, I have often noticed that in my experience over the decades, the best coaches haven't been boxing coaches, and MMA didn't exist. The best coaches I've run into have been wrestling coaches.
Yeah.
I don't quite know why that is, but they seem to have a better progression than anybody else out there, especially the really good college wrestling.
Yeah, that is interesting to ask why. I'm not sure.
I don't either.
But okay, so in terms of striking, though, I just say, you know, like I just said the other day in class, it's like showing something that, you know, for those of you who, I don't show a lot of like fancy head kicks and neck kicks, even though I like them, but they're not accessible to everybody. Right. But I will occasionally show, like, here's the possibility if you can get your leg up that high. Right. But the one caveat I always say is that, and I just said this the other night, is if you are throwing a kick, because most of us are less dexterous with our shins and our feet, right, than we are with our hands. And if you're going to throw a kick like that, you're responsible for your contact, right? Meaning, if your opponent happens to dip right as your leg's coming up, if they zig when you zag, right, you're responsible for being able to pull that on a dime. So we can work it here, but that doesn't mean just immediately go to it in sparring unless you're very sure you have that control. And that's something that can even be a challenge for like people who are experienced and are even fighting MMA. You know, I find that they sledgehammers, but they don't have that level of precision.
Yeah.
So it's something that you need to be able to work on. And then you need to have, again, you need to do isolation, set it at a certain level. Like you have to set a standard of a certain level of control. And then when we turn up the dial always presumes that level of control.
Yeah.
And I have people specifically trained to be able to pick up the speed while being able to maintain the control of their contact level. And once people are able to really spar at a competitive way, like when you see, especially when I was sparring all the time, like me going with some of my really experienced guys and stuff, I mean, it's full speed.
It looks like you guys are banging, but you're not making that kind of contact.
Right. So I might go home with, you know, a bruise on my shin. I might go home with, you know, a little bit of a Charlie horse on my quad or something like that. But what I'm not going home with is a headache.
Right.
And at the same time, that doesn't mean we're just going boop to each other's heads. You know, it's like you are fully throwing your body mechanics, but you're just not pushing through. Yeah. And then people say like, oh, you gotta hit hard. We'll just wear headgear. It's like, okay, so headgear is just going to basically be an invitation to increase the concussive force. And there's studies now to show that it doesn't really protect you that much, just sort of can actually disperse the force more, but you still absorb it. So I don't do headgear unless somebody has a cut or something like that. And I just prefer to be very progressive with the contact.
Yeah. So 25 years ago, we used to do that. 25 years ago, as you know, so like somebody who looks at the first Jeet Kune Do, functional Jeet Kune Do videos, everything's the contact was just way too hard, like the knees to the head and stuff, you know, all that's, I hope everybody knows, and people that haven't been following along with us over the last 20 years, that's changed a great deal. So we've learned from that. But on a real practical level, so you probably haven't had a chance to watch it yet, but because it just came out today. But for our monthly podcast, I had a chance to talk a couple weeks ago with Mark Stewart. And you might remember Mark from the JKD days.
Okay. Yep. I've heard the name.
Yeah, he was in the magazines and shooting videos and stuff. He was Ted Lukai-Lukai's senior student. And then after Ted died, he started to train with Ted Wong and pick up some of the original material. And so I was very interested in talking to him about the progressions. And so with Ted Lukai-Lukai, he's talking about it sounded like he was talking about doing a lot of the glove drills, which you and I would both been familiar with from the JKD days.
Right.
And those are like almost in a pattern, although you can break the pattern, you know, cross hook, cross, that kind of thing, jab, jab, pat, jab. Is that something you would do in Sit Yat Tong? Do you think there's a value to those kind of glove drills?
Purely on a introductory phase level.
Yeah.
Right. But when you start talking about going into crazy numbers of counts and things like that, right. the danger, as you very well know more than anybody, is how quickly that can become edified into a thing onto itself, and it starts to pull away from the original intention.
He mentioned that actually.
Skill development. Yeah.
He went to Thailand and they saw some of the crazy counts that they were doing in the Thai boxing he'd been exposed to. They're like, "What are you doing?" You know, their stuff is more one or two motions. But give me a practical standpoint. So when we talk about Muay Thai and learning how to do stand up, we're talking about Thai pads, and they do a lot of Thai pad work that's really alive and really functional. And then we're talking about focus mitts, and then we're talking about glove drills where both you and your partner are wearing gloves, but in each case you're drilling. From your standpoint, when you're teaching somebody and you're taking them, what would be a typical progression? At what point are you going to use Thai pads? At what point are you going to use focus mitts? At what point are you guys going to both glove up?
So in my foundations curriculum, just like we have a jiu-jitsu foundations, we have the striking foundations. We don't do sparring. It's a fairly short progression for people to go through the rotating curriculum and they graduate out of it. It's the same exact thing, right?
How many weeks?
I think it's I think it's about the same, like 18 lessons
It's
or
still
so. Right. And sometimes I'll do like, I kind of rotate through where it'll be basically is very similar. So I don't do one whole section for an entire week, but I'll always have a review of the previous class so that anybody who missed the last class will still get the review part. So they see it at least once a week, but then we start to phase into the next lesson. And then it just repeats. But the way that I would probably say it the simplest is principles, not templates, right? So I don't want people attached to counts. Last night, for instance, was class number 2 in the rotation, and it was all about the concept of how to optimize the kinetic chain with the concept of loading weapons from side to side, right? You know, think left feeding right, right feeding left. Okay, we talk about that on the level of the hands, then we start to tie in the legs, and then we talk about kind of at the end, it concluded with, now if you want to really know how to fluidly string all these things together, watch the before and after of how I'll do those same combinations that we're using as an example, but we're not tied to them, because again, it's the principle here, such as cross hook, cross hook, cross hook, right? But we're not rigidly attached to that because those could be any weapons.
Sure.
At the end, we show before and after on when I keep my posture fixed versus when I let my posture break in between. And all of a sudden you see, oh, right? Of course he's experienced, meaning me, like with the movement patterns, but what allows it to be smooth isn't just the experience, it's also the fact that I had control over my posture the whole time and I didn't let it change throughout the movements, you know? So what that does, my hope is always that I'm really trying to funnel down their understanding of what they're doing so that they're not dependent on the curriculum, the patterns, things like that. Like they're already understanding how to move right from the get-go. And then anything they see starts to slot into that. You know, they just kind of funnel the information in, and the learning curve gets much more concise.
And at this stage, they're working it on mitts, or they're working it on Thai pads, or what are they doing?
Yeah, a lot of times, sometimes we'll do Thai pads if it's things like just holding for a Thai kick initially, or knees and stuff, we'll use like the bigger shields. A lot of times for the ease of a foundations class, I find the simplest thing to do is to have them just sort of use their gloves as focus mitts, so that if they want to work back and forth. But then, yeah, we start to phase in partner work and pad work more in our more advanced program. And ultimately what I try and do is, I mean, granted, like they don't get the same level that I did have I won't say it was good fortune, but I also drove, 3 hours round trip every week and spent money and everything. But, you know, I trained privately with Mark for 15 years out of all the time, that we trained together, pretty much almost every week in a lot of cases. And so like I just had the best of the best pad work with him, and I learned how to hold pads. I won't say as good as he can, but I became a mini me, right, of him with pad holding, to the point where I can innovate my own shit too. I don't like, again, it's not a template, but the thing is, I really saw pad work with him for what it is, which is it should emulate the fight, right? It's not just a feed. It's like we would go a half hour sometimes without barely having a word spoken between us. And it's just reading the pads, and that's with him throwing things back at me, and, me like finding the holes and all that stuff. And we would, granted, this didn't just come out of the ether. We had trained together. So I was experienced to read those things, but he would show me where to hit with his body. Right. And he always had the pad in the right place, and so that comes with time. Right. But when you can do that, even learning that skill on a fundamental level, that builds really good strikers, really good fighters, because their understanding of the positioning and the openings and stuff, like literally you could spar very well just from having an excellent pad holder emulating that opponent for you. Right.
And that's such a complicated is not the right word, sophisticated art, right? How long would you say it took you to figure out how to hold pads that way?
Well, it would be quicker than somebody who only was going to regular classes, to be honest, just because that was my whole experience with him every week. But I would say it took me, I mean, I had a decent pad hold within like a year of, because whatever he would give me, I would immediately turn around and I go from consumer, like student, to creator, trainer, right? And bring it back to my place and hold pads for people, so I get the feel for it myself. But I think it took me probably a good, let's say maybe 5 or 6 years to really become proficient, where it was just flowing through me, and I was able to, I kind of had the smoothness of it.
Yeah, exactly. Now, interesting too, you like the most, if not all, the first crop of SBG coaches came through the JKD community just by happenstance, and that was kind of who I was speaking to when I first started getting publicity. Talk to me about your experience with JKD. Like, at what point did you stop training it? Why? And
I needed the red pill a little bit, because when I first started JKD, I thought the coolest shit was like all the who bud and the hand trapping and everything, and then what started to lead me down that path was just being honest with myself about the school I was in. A friend of mine who was my instructor, the school I was in, it was kind of like there was the JKD stuff, and the rationale there was kind of articulated the way that you saw, like this, again, reasoning by analogy that kind of was passed on, I think, through VUNAC, which was, here we have self-perfection and here we have self-preservation. So we've got the art and we've got the fighting.
Was he a VUNAC guy?
What's that?
Was he a VUNAC guy?
He was Richard Bastillo, but he trained with VUNAC as well. It's kind of in, all those circles. Yeah. But it's sort of like you adopt something that sounds like it makes sense, and then you kind of go down that road. So it's like we had Muay Thai, and then we had the JKD. And I would say between the JKD and the Filipino martial arts and everything, it's like kind of had the JKD side was like maybe 25 to 30% functional, right, whereas the Muay Thai was all functional for the most part. It's like it was solid. And I just started to be like, what would I actually fight with? Like when we're doing open mats, and I have some of these guys who are, I had a couple of my friends and training partners who were the guy where if you jab them once, they would start trying to, decapitate you, right? And when it came down to it, what was I using, right? So I was using the 30% maybe functional stuff from JKD, and I was using the Muay Thai. I wasn't using all the other shit. So then you just start to say, right, that's it. And then, it was like a little bit down the road, then I started seeing your stuff in Black Belt magazine, and then I got the DVD, and I was like, yeah, right. Exactly. So yeah, that's kind of how it came. And when I really opted out basically was when I finally, I went to him, and I just, because I'm always big about open communication, I just said, I really want to start going to Roberto's place. He knew who Roberto's was. It was basically right down the road. And from where we were at that time, and I just said, I just really want to learn jiu-jitsu. And he's like, I know you do. And yeah, that's cool, man. I mean, I know you want to do that and stuff. So I bounced back and forth going to both places for a while. And then after I really got the bug, I just kind of said, like, I really want to focus on this because I feel like I'm behind on that end of the spectrum. And, the striking, at least I've got a good base here. So I'd really like to immerse myself for a while. And he was like, I understand. So he was cool about it. But I think he was bummed to see me not be in that side anymore, or at least take a hiatus. But it was something that he knew that I was being very open about and honest about, and that I needed to do. And at that point I was just like, once you start rolling and everything, you just go like, man, I can't go back to anything that isn't functional anymore. Right. Because, as you pointed out many years ago, it's like, we don't even have enough time in our life to, especially at the age that we all started this, because we didn't start, when we were 4 or whatever. Yeah. We don't have time in our life to master the functional stuff that, that's never ending. Why would we spend any time on shit that isn't tied to that. That's only in martial arts rationalization fantasy world that people make those arguments, right? Absolutely. You should have this split between function and form. So
yeah, and that fallacy of self-preservation versus self-perfection is particularly annoying to me, because if there is as you know, if there is a self-perfection to be found in martial arts, it's going to be found in dedicating yourself to the fundamentals of a functional martial art and all the stuff that we have to go through to get to a legitimate black belt or to get to a legitimate striker, all those bruises and battles and that your ego has to go through for 20 years. That's where it's at. It's not in clicking sticks together or pretending to look a particular way. It's so ironic how backwards all that stuff is sometimes.
Yeah. And it's difficult, man, because again, I remember way back in the MMA.TV, the Underground Forum days, right? I think, you first and foremost, but then I got on along with Lewis, really. And the three of us were pretty vocal, trying to engage critical thinking with that crowd. And it kind of continues today. So like I've got a pretty big jiu-jitsu group, and I was going around in a circle with somebody just the other day, and it's to the point where, what drives me fucking crazy is like occasionally you get people that have this attitude like, man, like it's all talk and ideas and stuff, and like just get on the mat and train. It's all you need to do. It's like, yeah. So I'm gonna stop you right there for a second, because the best, highest percentage athletes, coaches, whatever, are never just train, right? Yeah, they train. They don't just talk, but they do both, right? They're not mutually exclusive. Yeah. Like what's going on in your brain, right? Like, let's not think that there's some moral value in being anti-thought, like anti-critical thinking and anti-intellectual. So it gets to the point where I've now taken this tap. So I saw so many of the same, like, fundamental logical fallacies, a lot of them reasoning by analogy, going on in my Facebook group over the course of years. And I would kind of make individual points to people and comments about them. Right. But then I see like what the next thing that they would say and the next thing they would say. So finally I said, you know what, I'm going to, just as a value add, I'm going to sit down. I did a 47-minute video where I categorized all the main fallacies into segments and anticipated what the responses are. And at the outset of this video, Glenn saw it. He was like laughing his ass up, right? But at the outset of this video, I said, okay, so based on personal experience, what is likely to happen here is that a lot of you will, you'll not watch it at all, or you'll watch maybe a few minutes of it, or you'll cherry pick like information while you're doing something else. And then you'll come back and you'll make the exact same reasoning by analogy statements that I address in the video. So I know how this goes, right? What's going to happen is then I'm going to say, hey, could you go back and watch the video because I addressed this here. And then you will counter, not by going and watching the video and then having something to say, by then citing some person who said something who's in a position of authority, which is reasoning from authority. Right. And then after that, when I call you on that and say that's reasoning from authority, then you're going to ultimately resort to ad hominem argument and insult me. And guess what fucking happens every single time? In that order, predictably. It's phenomenal, right? So, but yeah, it's difficult. But I think like one of the big things, it's why I'm trying to use this heuristic of first principles, is just to try and get people to say like, man, you can make your life so much easier if you really care about this thing that you spend all this time doing, and then you have all these long-term consequences that we've all been through with, injuries and getting beaten up and wear and tear and the frustrations that come with that and all the ego bruising and all that stuff. And you wrestle with these things. Isn't it worth it for you to take a little bit of time to actually engage with how you're thinking about what you're doing? Right. And then it will have actual material benefits for you, results on the mat. Yes. And, so that's kind of my mission. And I know sometimes it's a exercise in futility, but I continue to do it because there's people who lean into that and really get a lot from it. So
absolutely. No, I think it's a good mission. And I think it's interesting too. No matter what form of superstition you're arguing against, whether we're talking about religious superstition or medical woo-woo quackery or whatever it is, martial arts nonsense, it's always the same fallacies, almost always presented in the same order. It's like you can absolutely predict what's going to happen, right? They'll argue beginning that it works, and then when you show them it doesn't work, they'll argue, well, it doesn't work, but it's useful.
mm-hmm.
And then when you present, well, there's other ways that are even more useful that also work, then it becomes attack the messenger. And you can just kind of predict, you know, and you can see what they're going to use, the arguments they're going to use, anecdotal, and then argue from authority. And
Mm-hmm.
and it's such a human formula that the nice thing is, I think if somebody really does take the time, and I do think it's a good exercise for someone to really learn the arguments in any of those. And if we want to go way back, like the arguments for and against God have all of these, all the ontological and teleological arguments,
Right.
all that's incorporated from the time of the Greeks going back a couple thousand years. And you can see the same arguments used in martial arts. And once somebody gets used to those arguments into that form of logic, they can apply it to anything. You can apply it to martial arts. You can apply it to politics. You can apply it to anything. So I do think it's a useful exercise for people to learn that kind of critical thinking, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. Bring it back to Elon Musk for a second, right? Because it's like an interview I saw with him where he's out in front of one of the rockets at SpaceX, and basically he's saying, you know, well, I am actually the lead engineer here in SpaceX, and he actually lives in one of those little mini homes that's like 300 square feet, like on SpaceX. They just constructed for him. That's where he's second richest guy in the world, and aside from oil sheiks that have no documented income, right? And he's lives in a little box, but he's basically like, look, confirmation bias is very hard to overcome. It takes effort and attention. Sunken cost fallacy, which is basically what a lot of us see, where it's like the perfect example of sunken cost in martial arts was Royce Gracie. All of a sudden, Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, kind of takes hold in the consciousness of martial artists, and everybody's going, whoa, that's what's happening here, right? That's not what I thought reality looked like. Mm-hmm. And then you immediately see people are either going, I've got to learn that, or they're making excuses and rationalizations. Yep. And why are they making excuses and rationalizations? Because they have a sunken cost in years of effort and status and all those things that come with what they did. Yeah. And the difference is all of us went, and even yet, I feel those things, but even yet I'm going to pursue the truth. Yeah. And so those things are hard for people to do. And so Elon Musk thing is like, look, as engineers, the way that we approach this is, according to like the Pareto principle, like really we spend 80% of our time trying to decide if we're even asking the right questions. Again, that's coming from first principles, right? Effort is, are we even asking the right questions? Not assuming that those questions are right, and then trying to solve those problems. Once you've identified the right questions, then comparatively, the 20% of creating the solutions becomes much, much easier. Yeah. So, again, hard to do that everywhere in life, but if you can do that in some area that you devote a lot of time and energy to, in this case, jiu-jitsu, martial arts, right, then it's worth it. Absolutely.
That's a perfect place to stop. So it's been a pleasure to talk to you again, Steve. I think we'll...
Thanks, you too, brother.
Huh?
You too, brother. Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to talk to you. Thank you very much. I'll see you soon.
Okay. Take care.